courtroom smelled like old wood and anxiety. I noticed that the moment I stepped through the heavy oak doors, that particular combination of polished floors, recycled air, and the quiet dread that collects in places where families come apart. I'd been in rooms like this before. Different country, different stakes, different kind of silence. But that particular weight in the air, I recognized it. My brother saw me first. He was sitting at the far table with his lawyer, and when he turned and saw me standing in the doorway in my dress uniform, he actually laughed. Not a surprised laugh. A dismissive one. The kind that says you've got to be kidding me. He leaned over and said something to his attorney, and the man glanced at me and smiled a little too. My mother was in the gallery. She pressed her hand to her mouth. Her eyes went wide and then she looked away, the way she does when something embarrasses her. She's always done that. Look away first, ask questions later, or never. I walked to my table, set my folder down, pulled out the chair. The judge hadn't entered yet. The room was still filling up. A court reporter was arranging her equipment. Someone's phone buzzed and was quickly silenced. Ordinary Tuesday morning, except that my family was about to fight over the one thing my grandfather cared about most, and I was the only one in the room who understood why he left it to me. I should back up. My grandfather, Walter Hess, spent 41 years building something in eastern Tennessee. Not a business empire, not a fortune, just land. 83 acres outside a town called Wartburg, which is the kind of place that doesn't show up in travel magazines but has a certain kind of beauty that gets into you when you're young and never fully leaves. Rolling hills, a creek that ran cold even in August, a barn he built himself with 2 neighbors and a case of beer over one long weekend in 1979. He told me that story so many times I could draw you a map of where every board came from. I grew up spending summers there. My brother Garrett did too, technically, but Garrett discovered at around age 12 that he was more interested in air conditioning and video games than in anything requiring mud on your boots. That was fine. Grandpa Walter never forced anything. He just kept inviting us both, every summer, and I kept showing up. And eventually Garrett stopped coming, and it was just me and this old man who smelled like motor oil and black coffee and never ran out of things to teach me. He taught me how to read weather by cloud shape, how to fix a fence post properly so it doesn't just look fixed, how to sit quietly with someone without needing to fill the silence with noise. He had a way of listening that made you feel like whatever you were saying mattered completely, even if you were 11 years old and talking about something that definitely didn't matter at all. I joined the Army at 22, military intelligence. I'm not going to go into the specifics of what that career involved, because some of it I'm not permitted to discuss, and some of it I just don't talk about. What I'll say is that I spent 11 years doing work that required me to be very good at understanding situations that looked like one thing but were actually another. It turns out that's a skill my grandfather started teaching me when I was 8 years old, standing in a field asking me what I thought the weather was going to do and why. Grandpa Walter knew what I did. Not the classified details, but the shape of it. He was proud in that quiet way of his. Never said it directly, but when I came home on leave, he would sit across from me at dinner and just look at me sometimes with this expression that I can only describe as settled. Like he'd been waiting to see who I was going to turn out to be, and he'd gotten his answer. He died 18 months ago, went to sleep on a Thursday and didn't wake up on Friday, which is honestly the way he would have chosen. No fuss. No long goodbye, just Walter Hess, done. He left the property to me, not split between me and Garrett, not held in trust for the whole family. To me, specifically, with a letter in the will that said, and I'm paraphrasing, but only slightly, she's the one who knew what it was for. That letter caused a problem. Garrett had been expecting the property. I don't say that to be uncharitable. I think he genuinely had convinced himself over years of telling himself the story, that he was the one who deserved it. He'd visited Grandpa Walter regularly in the last few years. Holidays, birthdays, the occasional weekend. He brought his kids. He'd done all the visible things, and he'd been waiting. When the will was read and my name was there, something shifted in my brother that I don't think has shifted back. He hired an attorney named Gerald Fitch, who was known in Wartburg apparently for being the kind of lawyer people hired when they wanted to make something difficult. I know this because Grandpa Walter's estate attorney told me, quietly, over the phone, the week after the will reading, the argument Garrett and Gerald Fitch were planning to make was that our grandfather had been in mental decline in his final years, that I had cultivated a special relationship with him specifically to influence his estate decisions, and that the will did not reflect his true wishes. I want to be precise about what that accusation means. It means my brother was going to stand up in a courtroom and argue that I manipulated an old man who loved me. It means he was going to look at a judge and suggest that the 11 summers I spent on that property, the phone calls every other Sunday, the letters I sent from places I couldn't name on a map, that all of that was strategy, that I'd been working an angle since I was 8 years old. I didn't sleep well the week before the hearing. My mother called twice. She didn't say she supported Garrett exactly. She said things like, "I just wish this could be settled without a courtroom and your grandfather wouldn't have wanted this division." She wasn't wrong about the second part, but she also didn't say she thought the will should stand, and that absence said enough. I drove to Wartburg the Sunday before the hearing. Parked at the property, my property, though it still felt strange to think of it that way, and walked the fence line the way my grandfather used to. The creek was running. The barn needed paint. There was a section of fence on the north side that had been letting the neighbors' cattle through, and I made a note of it. I stood there for a while looking at the farmhouse. Then I drove back to my hotel room and laid out my dress uniform on the bed and asked myself if I was really going to do this. I decided I was. I hadn't worn it to anything in almost 2 years. It still fit. I'd made sure of that, not out of vanity but out of the same discipline that makes you check your equipment before you need it. The ribbons were in order. The rank insignia was correct. I pinned everything carefully, the way I'd been trained, and then I stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a long moment. I wasn't trying to intimidate anyone. I want to be honest about my reasons, because I've turned them over enough times to know what they actually were. I wasn't wearing that uniform to show off or to make Garrett feel small or to perform something for the judge. I wore it because my grandfather knew that uniform, because the last time he saw me in it, he'd stood on the porch of that farmhouse and watched me walk to my car. And he'd called out, I was almost at the road. He called out, "You do good work, honey." And I'd waved and kept walking because I didn't know it was the last time. I wore it because I wanted him in the room. That's the real reason. You can think whatever you want about it. I arrived 12 minutes early. The courtroom was already partially filled. I saw Garrett's wife in the gallery, and 2 of the neighbors who'd known our grandfather, and a woman from the County Historical Society who'd had some dealings with the property over the years. I saw my mother. She was sitting in the second row, hands folded in her lap, and when I walked through those doors in uniform, she did the thing I described. Hand to her mouth. Eyes wide, look away. My mother has always been better at processing things after the fact than in the moment. I've mostly stopped taking it personally. Garrett laughed when he saw me. His lawyer smiled. I sat down and opened my folder. Gerald Fitch was good at his job, I'll give him that. He opened with a methodical presentation of our grandfather's medical records from the last 3 years of his life, visits to a neurologist, a prescription for something that addressed mild cognitive concerns, a notation in one doctor's file about occasional memory lapses. He framed each piece carefully, building a picture that was technically accurate in its individual components and fundamentally dishonest in its overall impression. My grandfather had been sharp. Not perfect. He was 81 years old and he'd had some hard years, but sharp. He knew what he was signing. He'd had the will reviewed twice by 2 different attorneys, both of whom had assessed him as fully competent. One of those attorneys was prepared to testify. But I sat through Fitch's opening, and I listened, because that's what you do. You let people say what they're going to say. You learn things, even from the arguments you disagree with. Then Fitch said something I hadn't expected. He stood up straighter and turned slightly toward the gallery and said that it was worth noting for the record that the primary beneficiary had spent the majority of the last decade largely absent from the family, that her relationship with the decedent had been, quote, intermittent and idealized. and that a woman who had chosen a career that took her overseas repeatedly was perhaps not best positioned to claim a deep, ongoing bond with an elderly man in rural Tennessee. He said absent. He said idealized. I looked at my folder. I thought about a phone call I'd made from a forward operating base at 2 a.m. Tennessee time, because my grandfather had mentioned his hip was bothering him and I wanted to make sure he'd called the doctor. I thought about a birthday card I'd mailed from a country whose name I can't say here because it was the kind of country you weren't supposed to be in officially, and I'd addressed it to Walter Hess, the best man I know. I thought about sitting on the porch of that farmhouse at 19 years old, the summer before I enlisted, and telling him I was scared. And him saying, very simply, very directly, the scared ones are the ones who do it right. I didn't say any of that then. I wrote a note on my legal pad instead. The judge's name was Honorable Patricia Dunmore. She had been on the bench in Morgan County for 14 years. She had the particular quality of good judges everywhere, which is that she paid attention to everything and showed nothing. She listened to Fitch's presentation. She listened to my attorney's opening. And then she looked at me, not my attorney, at me specifically, and she said, "Captain, I understand you have documentation you'd like to enter into the record." I said yes. I stood up, and I walked to the bench, and I handed her the folder. It contained, in organized sections, 11 years of correspondence between myself and Walter Hess, including letters he had written to me and letters I had written to him, many of them postmarked from overseas. A series of photographs spanning from my childhood to 3 years ago, showing the two of us on that property across decades. A handwritten note, dated 14 months before his death, in which my grandfather wrote in his own hand, clearly and without ambiguity, that he wanted the land to go to me because I was, quote, the only one who ever asked me what it meant. And a document I had not planned to use but had brought as a contingency, a commendation letter, signed and official, referencing work I had done that had directly contributed to the protection of American personnel overseas. I had not brought it to impress anyone. I brought it because Gerald Fitch had used the word absent, and I wanted the record to reflect what absent had actually looked like. Judge Dunmore read through the folder slowly. The courtroom was quiet. Then she looked up. She looked at me for a moment. Just a moment, with an expression that I would not call sympathy exactly. It was more like recognition. Like she'd been doing this long enough to know the shape of things. She turned to Gerald Fitch and said, "Counselor, I'm going to need you to walk me through the specific evidence of undue influence, because what I'm looking at suggests a consistent, decades-long relationship documented extensively by both parties." Fitch began to respond. He talked about the medical records, the cognitive notations, the neurologist visits. Judge Dunmore said, "I've read those. I'm asking about undue influence. Those are two different arguments." The room got very still. Garrett was looking at me from across the room. I met his eyes once. I didn't look away and I didn't hold the stare. I just met it neutrally and then looked back at the judge. But in that one moment, I saw something cross his face that wasn't anger. It was something closer to grief, I think. Or the beginning of it. I understood it. I didn't have room for it right then, but I understood it. Gerald Fitch pivoted to his secondary argument, which was that the will should at minimum be modified to provide Garrett with a share of the property's monetary value, even if the land itself went to me. It was a more moderate position and, honestly, a smarter one to end on. He presented it with more care than the undue influence argument, and I could see Judge Dunmore give it more consideration. My attorney responded. She was precise and she was calm, and she walked through the legal documentation carefully. And then something happened that I had not planned for and cannot fully explain even now. My mother stood up. She was not called. She was in the gallery. She just stood up and Judge Dunmore looked at her, and there was a moment where the whole room seemed to hold its breath, and the judge said, "Ma'am, are you represented here today?" My mother said, "No, Your Honor. I need to say something." The judge looked at her for a moment. "This isn't standard procedure." "I know," my mother said. "I'm sorry. but I've been sitting here and I need to say something before we go any further. Judge Dunmore considered this. You have 1 minute. My mother turned, not to the judge, to me. She said, "Your grandfather called me 3 months before he died. He told me what he was planning. He told me he'd thought about it for a long time and he was at peace with it. I told him I was worried it would cause trouble." She paused. "So Hoon, he said Margaret's daughter earned that land the way I earned it. She showed up. That's what he said." The gallery was silent. My mother sat back down. She was looking at her hands. I had not known about that phone call. I won't say the hearing ended cleanly after that, because it didn't. There were more arguments, more documentation, 2 recesses, and a long deliberation period during which I sat outside on a wooden bench and ate a granola bar and watched a sparrow investigate a crack in the sidewalk. But when Judge Dunmore came back and read her ruling, the land was mine. The will would stand as written. The estate would be distributed as my grandfather had intended. Garrett's challenge was not sustained. Garrett walked out without looking at me. His wife followed. I understood that too. Some things take time to become conversations, and some things never do, and you can't always know in advance which category you're dealing with. My attorney shook my hand. The court reporter started packing up her machine. I looked across the room and my mother was still sitting there, alone now, everyone else filing out around her. She was looking at me. When I met her eyes, she didn't look away this time. I walked over and sat down next to her. She said, "I should have said that sooner, not just today, before all of this." I said, "Yeah." We sat there for a while. The court reporter left. A bailiff came through and propped open a side door, and the sound of the hallway came in. Footsteps. A distant phone. The ordinary noise of a building going about its day. My mother reached over and touched one of the ribbons on my chest, lightly, just for a second. She said, "I never understood what you were doing out there. I worried about you. I didn't know how to ask." I said, "I know. Are you going to keep the property?" "Yes." She nodded, looked at her hands again. "The north fence has been down for months. The neighbors' cattle keep getting through." I said I'd already noticed. I drove out to the property that evening, parked where I always park, by the big oak at the entrance to the drive, and walked to the farmhouse as the light went golden low. The barn needed paint. The fence on the north side needed work. The gutters had leaves in them from last fall, and there was a section of porch board that had started to soften and would need replacing before winter. I stood there with my hands in my pockets and looked at all of it. My grandfather had built that barn with 2 neighbors and a case of beer over one long weekend in 1979. The boards had held. The foundation was sound. The things built right hold longer than they're supposed to. I went back to my car and got the work gloves I keep behind the seat, started pulling leaves from the gutters while there was still light to see by. There was a lot to do. I'd been trained to be practical about that kind of thing, not to be overwhelmed by a long list, just to identify the next right action and start there. The gutters were the next right action, so I started there. The creek was running somewhere below the property. I could hear it, but not see it. The air smelled like Tennessee in May, soil and pine and something green just starting. A woodpecker worked at something in the tree line. A car passed on the road below and its headlights swept briefly across the field. I kept working until it got dark. Then I went inside, found a blanket that still smelled like the cedar chest my grandfather kept it in, and I sat down in the chair by the front window and I watched the light go out of the sky. He'd earned this land. He built something real in a place that required real effort, and he'd kept it for 41 years, and then he'd handed it to the person he thought understood what that meant. I was going to make sure he was right about that. The fence on the north side could wait until morning. Everything else could wait until morning. I had time now, the particular kind of time that comes when something uncertain becomes settled, when the thing you are fighting for is finally, simply, yours. I sat in my grandfather's chair in my grandfather's house, and I listened to the creek and I let the quiet be quiet. That was enough for one day. I've thought about that courtroom a lot since then. Not the ruling, the moment before it. The moment when Judge Dunmore opened that folder and the room got quiet and my brother's lawyer stopped talking mid-sentence. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired mostly, and a little sad in a way I didn't expect. That's the thing nobody tells you about being right. It doesn't feel the way you think it will. What I kept coming back to in the weeks after was something my grandfather Walter used to say when I was young and upset about something. Some injustice at school, some friend who'd treated me badly. He'd listen until I was done, and then he'd say, "The work you do when no one's watching is the only work that actually counts." I didn't understand it at 8 years old. I thought he was telling me to be patient, and that felt like the adult's way of saying just accept it. But that's not what he meant at all. He meant that character isn't something you perform. It's something you build quietly over years in rooms where no one sees you and no one's keeping score. The letters I wrote from places I couldn't name. The phone calls at 2 a.m. his time because I wanted to make sure he'd seen a doctor. The summers I showed up because I wanted to, not because anyone expected me to. None of that was strategy. It was just who I was, and he saw it. And eventually it mattered in a way I never planned for. Garrett made different choices. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because it's true and because I think it matters to understand it clearly. He showed up when it was visible. Holidays, birthdays, the occasions with witnesses. That's not nothing. But there's a difference between the kind of presence that wants to be seen and the kind that just keeps showing up regardless. My grandfather knew the difference. He'd spent 81 years learning to tell them apart. The thing about cause and effect is that it operates on a long timeline. You don't always see the connection between what you put in and what comes back to you, because sometimes decades pass between one and the other. I spent 11 years doing work that required me to be disciplined and honest and thorough even when it was hard, and even when no one was going to thank me for it. That's not why I did it. I did it because it was right and because it was mine to do. But those same qualities are exactly what my grandfather recognized in me. The same qualities that meant he trusted me with something he'd spent his whole life building. That's not luck. That's not fate. That's just the math of how a person's choices accumulate over time. My mother touched my ribbons in that courtroom and said she'd never understood what I was doing out there. I think about that a lot. I think there are people in our lives who love us and still can't see us clearly, and that's painful. But it doesn't mean we stop being who we are while we wait for them to catch up. You can't build your integrity around someone else's ability to recognize it. You build it anyway. You show up anyway. You do the work anyway. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the record speaks for itself when it needs to. The north fence is fixed now. The barn has a fresh coat of paint. I replaced the soft board on the porch before the first frost, and the gutters are clear, and the farmhouse is standing the way it's supposed to stand. There's a lot still to do, and I'm doing it one thing at a time, the way my grandfather taught me. He left me that land because I understood what it was for. I'm doing my best to make sure he was right.